So Lent, here we are again, first Sunday in Lent. And Jesus is again in the wilderness for 40 days, starving and being tempted. For us, Lent uses the same 40 days of temptation to tempt us. And we use this time to reflect and pray and fast and give up and notice different aspects of our lives, especially in relation to God, in relation to the gospel, in relation to worship. Well, it's what most of us aspire to, isn't it? But it's a bit like New Year's resolutions. We start off strong, but we often fall off along the way. We often, I don't know about you, I'm speaking from experience, but we often kind of fall off the path once and go, oh, we wrecked it, and just stay off. Yeah. So this is the first Sunday in Lent, and it's recognised as a day of respite from whatever discipline you've been enforcing on yourself. You might not have known that. Lent is actually 46 days long by the calendar. So from Ash Wednesday to Easter, 46 days. The reason we don't include Sundays in our Lenten discipline is because they're feast days or mini Easter days, and as such are excluded from the penitential season of Lent. And maybe that will help you in your discipline by giving you a get out of jail free clause. These Lenten Sundays are like respite, if you like, from the discipline we inflict on ourselves. They're like a break or a hold or a semicolon in the contract we've made with ourselves and with God. It means if you've given something up or taken on something extra for Lent, then on Sundays, theoretically, you can break from that. Sundays remind us that we are post-Easter people and live in the resurrection always. So, I thought I'd talk a little bit about normal Lenten practice for those of us who've ever practiced it, and if you've never practiced it, then maybe you'd like to have a think about it. So, normal Lenten practice for Christians involves choosing something to give up for Lent, a fast of sorts. And most often people give up something that's bad for them, like sugar or chocolate or alcohol. In more recent times, younger people give up games, social media, streaming services. I know one person who's given up Vegemite. I know. Whatever you give up, though, it should be tempered with taking something else on. So if you waste, say, 30 minutes a day and about $10 in the consumption of alcohol that you've given up for Lent, then it's commonly held that those 30 minutes and that $10 should be dedicated to God or God's people in some way. Sort of that's the rationale behind it. So in addition to fasting of something during Lent, we should also add something of equal or greater value to kind of compensate. Most commonly, we're encouraged to add study, prayer, and or generous giving. Whatever you decide to add in, though, some sort of structure or plan should guide you. You should have some sort of idea what you're doing and where you're going. Christian study, for example, is always something we should aspire to every day, 365 days a year. But it is especially important during Lent. A Lenten study, even if you do no other study through the year, a Lenten study is a great place to begin that discipline of some kind of formal, structured study. There is a richness in studying with like-minded people, all learning, struggling, and wrestling with the same piece of scripture that you are. As well as, or instead of, a group study, many like to engage in some sort of individual or personal enrichment program as well. That's those little books I showed you at the beginning. That's what they're good for. Whichever form of study you choose, however, there should be a sense of journeying with Jesus. Another addition during Lent is prayer. And there are a couple of ways to tackle this. So if you're new to prayer, or you struggle with the whole concept of prayer, there are lots of different approaches. Simple as going for a walk, and as difficult as something rigorous that takes hours of meditation. But one of my favourite ways, and it's simple, to engage with God is to just have a conversation. Usually I choose somewhere solitary and just start speaking as if your best friend was right next to you and you wanted to tell them all about something or ask their opinion. For Lent, though, I try and encourage you to not go with your most familiar practice, but move outside of your comfort zone a little bit and try something different. There are many ways of connecting to God through prayer. Generally, the most simple way is just to recognise God's presence with you. An exercise you could try is to spend 2 minutes each day only giving thanks. You're not allowed to ask God for anything. You simply have to give thanks. And if you find 2 minutes easy, then perhaps aim for 5 minutes. However, my guess is it's harder than what you initially think it'll be. We are so accustomed to asking God for something during prayer that gratitude alone is difficult. Gratefulness without self-interest or involvement is really hard to practice, but it carries its own rewards. Now, you might have noticed that I'm only suggesting that you engage for, say, 2 minutes of prayer initially. Of course, you can do more, and you might routinely find that 2 minutes is nowhere near enough time. But your brain needs to not feel pressure into something just because you believe it's the right thing to do or somebody else expects it of you. If it's too hard or simply obligatory, you'll give it up at the first hurdle. If it's easy and doable, you'll excel. Basic human psychology. Committing to something small is always more effective than going whole hog from the outset, which is actually more what we're prone to do. But any amount of time you spend in Lenten prayer will be sufficient because it's like a contract between you and God. Lastly, of our Lenten disciplines is to give or give generously. Now, I'm not going to be specific with that, and you don't need to be either. You can choose to support one thing or many things. But giving generously is exactly what it sounds like. Giving generously without reserve of something you have, time, money, talent, kind, to someone or something that you've identified as in want or need. Jesus came up from his baptism and the heavens opened and God declared his paternity. You are my son. And then he was sent into the wilderness to battle human temptation. The whole premise of Lent is something similar to Jesus' experience, but tempered with our lived experience, our 2022, 21st century lived Western culture experience. And it's important to remember that what you're being asked of in Lent is to some degree the same as what was asked of Jesus, just slightly shorter and slightly less. Because, you know, Jesus is God and you're not. So Lent asks us to fast. Jesus is told, command this stone to become bread. Was Jesus tempted by the idea of easy food? Well, yeah, of course. He's hungry, after all. We are asked to choose a fast. Some kind of fast which reminds us of Jesus' hunger, reminds us of his temptation, reminds us that there's an easy fix. And we're also given a get out of jail free clause, just like Jesus is. Command and it's yours, the devil says. Why suffer? Who's it for? Our fast should reflect that. It should be hard enough that we're tempted to break it, but not so hard that we do. We should recognise the manipulation of the world to change our resolve and weather the temptation. Next, Jesus wanted his people to thrive. He already knew who he was and how he could achieve it. He is God after all. But Jesus was also human and, like us, tempted to take shortcuts from time to time. He knew the outcome of his life. He knew that after a time he would die, most likely a horrible death. There was no other way, and he knew it. But was he tempted to take a different path? Of course. Who wouldn't be? If we truly believe he was fully human, then yes, of course he was tempted. You would be. The thing is, when it's easy, there's no growth. When it's harder and we have to ask harder questions, then there's a sense of fulfillment. To seek deeper answers is to become the seed that grows in rich soil and bears much fruit. If we give in to temptation, we become more like the shallow-rooted plants that can't bear fruit. And through all this, we remember that we are not God. We can't do the whole 40 days in one hit. We'd like to, but we can't. We do instead what we can to the level that we can achieve it, and each one of us is different. We fast and pray and study and give a little in order to grow a lot. Jesus starved himself for 40 days. Even if he was able to eat on Sundays and only fast for the 6 days in between, which I'm suggesting we could do, it was still a mammoth feat. Can you imagine not eating for 6 days? Can you imagine not eating for 6 hours? Most of us can't. Jesus had to complete control and authority within his grasp and rejected it. And he suffered. He lost, he was damaged and denied for a long time. 6 weeks is a long time. Imagine. Because I actually can't. I'm not God. And my brain will only go so far, will only stretch so far. Jesus was God. So we don't tend to think of him as being wretched or despairing or sad even, as he doesn't eat for 40 days. But we believe Jesus is also a man, human, with the whole gamut of emotions and feelings and needs just like any one of us. Tempted? Of course he was tempted. That's the whole point of the story, to emphasise Jesus' humanity, to highlight his human frailties, his human struggle, his human temptation, and give us a way to enter the story also. If it was just God, it would be easy. It's like, well, he's God. That's easy for him. But because of his humanity and because of his willingness to suffer, we have a way to enter the story. Who of you have gone up to someone who's grieving and been able to be with them because you know that grief? Because you can enter their story. It's not the same, can't be, but you can enter their story because you've lived it through your experience. We get to enter Jesus' story because we can live it through his experience. More human psychology. That's the lesson here. We can transplant ourselves into Jesus' space and say, I couldn't do that. I couldn't do what he did. You might even say, I wouldn't want to. That it's impossible, especially alone. But Jesus was not alone. And neither are we. The only way Jesus survived his temptations was because God was with him. God's presence, God's help, God's love. Same for us. We get to survive our experience by recognising that God's with us, entered into our experience, walking alongside like a friend or a brother. We get to notice. And even if you can use that framework for your prayer and talk to God just like that, that's the point. After 40 days, the angels came and cared for him, and he went from that place into the world, and he ministered to his people, and God was with them all. To be out in the world, to know 100% that God is with you. You can weather anything because you've entered the experience. The Lord be with you.